On the evening of the 19th of January, 1931, a telephone rang at a chess club in the centre of Liverpool. The man who answered took down a message for one of the members, a quiet insurance agent who had not yet arrived. The caller gave his name as R.M. Qualtrough. He said he wanted to discuss some business, something about insurance for his daughter, and he left an address for the following evening, 25, Menlove Gardens East. It was an ordinary message, the kind an insurance man received all the time. Nobody thought anything of it. But within 48 hours that single phone call would sit at the center of a murder investigation, a death sentence, and a legal decision without precedent in English history. For almost a century since, people have asked the same question about that voice on the line. Was it a stranger arranging a genuine appointment? Or was it the most careful murderer Britain has ever failed to catch, building an alibi one sentence at a time? This is the story of the Wallace case, and the reason it has never been closed. The message left at the chess club is where the strangeness begins. On the night of the call, Wallace was due to play in a chess tournament. He had not yet arrived when the phone rang. The caller, Qualtrough, seemed to know that Wallace would be at the club that evening, and seemed content to leave a message rather than speak to him directly. The telephone he used was later traced to a public call box only a few hundred yards from Wallace's own home. And there was a small, telling detail. The operator recorded that the caller had difficulty getting through, and complained that his coins had not been returned, prompting the exchange to note the call. That accidental record fixed the time and the place of the call with unusual precision. Someone, that night, stood in a cold phone box near Wolverton Street and asked specifically for William Wallace, leaving a name that no one could ever trace to a real person, and an address that no one could ever find. Whether that someone was a customer or a killer is the hinge on which the entire case turns. The next evening, the 20th of January, Wallace set out to keep the appointment. He later said he had never heard of a customer named Qualtrough, but the promise of new business was not something a commission-paid insurance agent could easily ignore. He left Julia at home, alive and well, at around 6:45. Neighbors and a milk delivery boy would become crucial to the timing later. Wallace took a tram across the city towards the southern suburb of Mossy Hill, where Menlove Gardens was said to be. He was, by his own account and the accounts of everyone he spoke to, unhurried, polite, and openly asking for directions the entire way. He asked the tram conductor. He asked a second conductor. He asked a policeman. He asked a man at a newsagent, and the residents of the streets he passed. He was, in effect, stamping his own name and face into the memory of a dozen strangers across South Liverpool. To the police, that would later look like either a completely innocent man, or a very clever one making certain he would be remembered far from the scene of a crime. When Wallace reached the district, he discovered a problem that would define the case. There was a Menlove Gardens North, a Menlove Gardens South, and a Menlove Gardens West. But there was no Menlove Gardens East. The address he had been given did not exist and never had. He walked the streets in the dark, checking numbers, growing puzzled. He knocked on the door of number 25 Menlove Gardens West to be sure. He stopped a man and asked him. He even called at a local shop and spoke to the people inside. Finally, he found a police constable and asked him directly where Menlove Gardens East might be, and mentioned, almost in passing, that he was there on business and could not find the address. He checked his watch against the constable's. It was around 7:15. Only then, having failed completely, did Wallace give up and begin the long journey home across the city. Every person he had troubled would later swear to having met him. He had built, whether by accident or design, a chain of witnesses stretching from one side of Liverpool to the other. It was close to 9 o'clock when Wallace arrived back at Wolverton Street. What happened next was witnessed, in part, by his neighbors, and that timing would matter enormously. Wallace said he tried the front door and found it fastened. He went round to the back door, and it too would not open, or seemed not to. Just then, his next-door neighbors, the Johnstons, came out into the alley on their way to visit family. Wallace spoke to them. He said he could not get into his own house and was worried. Julia had not been well. As the three of them stood there, Wallace tried the back door once more, and this time it opened. He went inside while the Johnstons waited, uneasy, in the yard. A few moments later his voice came back to them from within the house, calling them in. Something, he said, was terribly wrong. The presence of those two witnesses on the doorstep at the exact moment of discovery would become one more strange, disputed thread in a case that seemed to be made of nothing but strange, disputed threads. Inside the small front parlour, the room the Wallaces kept for best and rarely used, Julia lay dead. She had been struck down with great force. A gas fire had been lit in the room. Wallace's raincoat, a mackintosh, was found beneath her, partly burned. The killing had plainly been sudden and ferocious, the work of moments. And yet the room told a confusing story. A cabinet had been disturbed and a small cash box emptied of about £4, the week's collected premiums, suggesting robbery. But other valuables sat untouched in plain sight. There was blood in the parlour, but the rest of the tidy little house was undisturbed and clean. When the police examined Wallace himself, they found almost nothing on him, no significant blood-staining of the kind they would expect on whoever had delivered such violence. For a man who had supposedly just battered his wife to death and then calmly crossed the city, he was impossibly clean. For an intruder who had come to steal £4, the fury of the attack made no sense. From the very first hour, the scene refused to fit any simple explanation. Everything now depended on the clock, and the clock is where the case against Wallace began to crack. The prosecution needed Julia to have been alive very late, so that Wallace could have killed her just before leaving. But a 14-year-old milk delivery boy named Alan Close had spoken to Julia at the door as he handed over the milk that evening, and his account placed her alive at a time that left Wallace almost no window to commit the murder, clean himself completely, and reach the tram where conductors remembered him. The minutes simply would not stretch. To have done it, Wallace would have needed to kill his wife in a frenzy, remove every trace from his body and clothing, arrange the room, and walk out composed, all in a handful of minutes, and then perform the role of a relaxed traveler asking for directions. Investigators reconstructed the timings again and again. The tighter they drew the schedule, the more impossible it looked. This was the paradox at the center of the Wallace case. The very journey that made him look guilty was also the thing that gave him almost no time to be guilty at all. In April 1931, William Herbert Wallace stood trial for the murder of his wife at St. George's Hall in Liverpool. The prosecution laid out its theory: the disguised phone call, the invented customer, the alibi billed from strangers. The defense answered that the case was made entirely of suspicion and coincidence, with no weapon ever found, no motive ever established, no blood on the accused, and a timeline that bordered on the impossible. The couple's devotion was not in dispute, no affair, no debt, no quarrel had ever been shown. The trial gripped the country. And then the jury returned, after barely an hour, with a verdict that stunned many who had followed the evidence. Guilty. The judge passed the only sentence the law allowed for murder. William Wallace, the quiet insurance agent who played chess and the violin, was condemned to death. To a great many observers, including lawyers and journalists who had sat through every day of it, the verdict seemed to rest not on proof but on the sheer strangeness of the story, as if the jury had punished Wallace for being at the center of something they could not understand. What happened next had never happened before. Wallace's lawyers appealed, and in May 1931 the Court of Criminal Appeal did something without precedent in English legal history. It quashed the conviction, not on a technicality, not because of a mistake in the judge's directions, but on the ground that the verdict could not be supported having regard to the weight of the evidence. In plain terms, 3 senior judges ruled that the jury had simply got it wrong, that the evidence had never been strong enough to justify a conviction at all. It was the first time an English court had overturned a murder verdict in that way, substituting its own judgment of the facts for the jury's. William Wallace walked out of the shadow of the gallows a free man. The decision made legal history and is still studied today. But freedom, in his case, did not mean vindication, and it certainly did not mean peace. He returned to a city where a great many people still quietly believed he had beaten his wife to death and very nearly got away with the perfect crime. If Wallace did not kill Julia, then someone else stood in that cold phone box, invented Mr. Qualtrough, and walked into the little parlour on Wolverton Street. Over the decades, researchers returned again and again to one name that had drifted at the edges of the original investigation. A young man who had once worked for the Prudential, knew Wallace, knew the collection round, and knew that the house sometimes held the week's premium money. He had, it was said, a grudge and an unreliable account of his own movements that night. Decades later, journalists and authors re-examined the old evidence and argued that this man, not Wallace, fitted the role of the phantom caller far better. That individual, like everyone else in the case, has been dead for many years, and no charge was ever brought against him. What survives is theory, not proof, and it must be treated as such. But it points to the deeper reason the Wallace case still haunts people. There is a version of that night in which an innocent man was convicted, freed, broken, and buried, while the person who made the call was never even questioned in court. So what really happened on the 20th of January, 1931? The honest answer is that no one knows, and no one now ever will. The Wallace case has been called the perfect murder mystery, and the crime writer Raymond Chandler, who studied it closely, judged it unbeatable, a puzzle with no satisfying solution from any angle. If Wallace was guilty, he was one of the coldest and most meticulous killers in the record, a gentleman who built a flawless alibi out of a phone call and a fake address. If he was innocent, then he was the victim of a monstrous frame and a monstrous miscarriage, convicted of murdering the wife he loved and left to die in disgrace while the real caller walked free. Both versions are terrible, and the evidence, more than 90 years on, still refuses to choose between them. What remains is a quiet street, a devoted couple, a telephone ringing in a chess club, and a name that belonged to no living man. Thank you for watching. If you found this case as haunting as we do, consider subscribing, and we will meet again with another story history never quite managed to close.